Hello, everyone, and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. And for our third segment of the day here on the show, like I said, we're going to transition a little bit into the world of college football, talking about fantasy stars of the weekend in that department. A lot of these guys on this list are surprises, unsung heroes, or just guys who deserve their respect for what they've achieved throughout their seasons or just their careers as well. And I feel like this list is the most versatile, most diverse of all the lists I've compiled here on the podcast. And I appreciate that, you fantasy college football fans out there, however few or many you may be, seem to like this list because it just goes to show how deep of not necessarily a thing, but how deep of a connection college football and fantasy college football will have for the future of the sport. And if you're a Dynasty League fan even, this adds a lot of value as well. To see so many unsung players who don't get a lot of media attention, who might go to smaller profile schools, how these segments could really help bolster, your mindset towards different modes of fantasy football, different ways to play. And so without further ado, let's jump right into my college football fantasy stars of the week. Starting off with a guy, speaking of unsung heroes, when we talk about this team, the Boise State Broncos, you only think of one guy, Ashton Jeanty. A presumable Heisman favorite, a guy seemingly destined for New York, potentially destined to break some records this season. But we often forget that Boise State is at this level, at this juncture of the season, in a place to compete for the CFP playoff spot because of a team. And on this team is a lot of good players, including this young man at the quarterback position. Oops, wrong guy. Maddox Maxson. 24 of 32. 307 passing yards, 4 touchdowns for a total of 30.8 fantasy points. When we think about the Boise State Broncos, it seems kind of safe to say that Ashton Jeanty is the biggest reason why these Broncos are in contention, because he is doing incredible things that no one's seen before on a football field, and the hype surrounding him is so high. Such a small profile school. We often forget that the guy in the backfield with him is just as much talent. His performance against a solid San Diego State team that solidifies the reason why Boise State is more than just a quote-unquote group of 5 representative. If they get into the college football playoff, they could potentially be a bracket buster once they get into the CFP, if they do, because of a guy like Maddox Maxson elevating his game to supplement what Jeanty can do. And not for nothing, another guy on this list from Boise State, and we're going to talk about later, Latrell Caples, can do that as well. This is not just an individual effort here. There's a multiplicity to this Boise State Broncos team. And so kudos to Maddox Maxson for making people, perhaps for just one moment, kind of forget about the brilliance of Ashton Jeanty, no matter how hard that is to do. I just wanted to applaud him for that. But speaking of solid quarterbacks, not unsung heroes, guys who are established in their college careers, let's talk of Mr. Jackson Dart a little bit. Kind of separating himself right now as perhaps the best quarterback in the SEC. Who would have thought we'd be saying that this late in the season? We have guys like Carson Beck, Quinn Ewers, Jalen Milroe in this conference. We often forget about a guy like Jackson Dart, but he, throughout his college football career, in this Lane Kiffin offense, has proven to be one of the most explosive, exciting young quarterbacks to talk about. He might not be a high draft pick, but his college career is at a place where a lot of people would be envious of what he's doing. This game is the second game where a SEC quarterback has thrown for over 500 yards and 6 touchdowns. Shout out to the other guy who did it, a former Seattle Seahawk, Drew Lock. That's an impressive stat to tell your friends. The only 2 quarterbacks in the SEC to do that, achieve that stat. And Jackson Dart looked very impressive doing it. A potential trap game, nonetheless, against an Arkansas team that could have beat them on a good day. 25 of 31, 515 yards, 6 touchdowns for a total of 49.3 fantasy points. We talk about quarterbacks that, from an interesting fantasy perspective, if you are a Dynasty League player, if you are a fantasy college football enthusiast even, Jackson Dart is someone you can get behind. He may not be the attention getter, or he may not even seek attention like other SEC quarterbacks. But he is one of the most solid in the entire conference, and should he have an NFL career, always look out for him as someone who can develop and grow because he's showing impressive traits and numbers to prove it and back it up. Can separate him from a lot of different quarterbacks in that kind of draft discussion. Even if he doesn't even enter this year's draft, he may, I believe, still be eligible for one more year of college play. But wherever his career takes him, just know that he's a very special player that you can't ignore. Not many people come around and put up this stat line in the competitive SEC, and Jackson Dart is one of only 2 people to ever do so, so I wanted to give him his flowers as well. Let's get to some skill position players. Speaking of records being broken, let's talk about Xavier Restrepo. This is a guy this year may have been a little bit disappointing to some people. May not have lived up to the lofty standards of being a wide receiver 1, perhaps the deepest, most impressive, fearsome wide receiver cores in the country. This game proves why. I believe the records he broke in this game were for most receiving yards, most receptions, I believe most receiving touchdowns by a Miami Hurricane. Truly someone who Miami Hurricanes can really appreciate as a player, but not necessarily someone who we've mentioned a ton of on this show, just because, of how well this Miami Hurricanes offense operates, even when star players might not be playing up to par. But Xavier Restrepo, on a record-breaking day, 8 catches, 146 yards, 3 touchdowns, 36.6 points, has to be included on my list. He's been a standout player in his college career, finally with an opportunity to do something special, to end his college career, win a national championship for a Miami team that, by hook or by crook, has looked really good, one of the only remaining unbeaten teams in the country. And Xavier Restrepo, someone, like I said, who may not have been the best this season, may not have lived up to his lofty goals that he set for himself. But he still has the ultimate goal ahead of him. And because of this team, because of its value, because of the players around him, he can rely upon a foundation that wasn't necessarily there at the start of his career. That if he ever plays poorly, he knows his team can lift him up, and he knows that he in turn can lift them up as well in certain performances. Because Miami has it. They have the it factor to be a national championship contender. They have some things on the defensive side to kind of fix, but on the offensive side, they can score with anybody. But it's all going to be about the trust this roster has in each other, and the special moments it can create, like Xavier Restrepo's record-setting day on Saturday. And the last player I want to acknowledge is a player who not many people may have heard of, but certainly someone who has been around the block a little bit. A junior at Oklahoma who kind of needed a pick-me-up in, albeit a very cupcake game against an FCS main squad that was not necessarily going to compete in this one, but just showing this offense still has some hope to it. Javonte Barnes, 18 carries, 203 yards, 3 touchdowns, 40.7 fantasy points. And like I said, it's an Oklahoma Sooners team that really hasn't gotten much going on the offensive side of the football, whether it be the struggles of first-year starter Jackson Arnold and then true freshman Michael Hawkins Jr., the struggles of the offensive line, just nothing really working, coalescing for this Oklahoma Sooners team. But, this felt like a wake-up call, and in a game where they felt like they had to get right against an FCS squad, Javonte Barnes proved that there might be some hope in the stretch run to go bowling, get a nice bowl game, because they aren't necessarily going to compete for the CFP. But it just goes to show that sometimes on any given Saturday in college football, any player can have value at any certain time. And yes, sometimes you have to find the matchups. Oklahoma playing a very weak Maine team. It just goes to show that week in, week out, unsung heroes can arise. When I look at this list and look at all these players, the journeys they've gone through, Madsen, questions about him even being the starting quarterback for the Boise State Broncos, bringing in former 5-star recruit and USC transfer Malachi Nelson. Nobody really thought that Max Madsen would have a shot. And he's given it, and he's captained this team very well, with Ashton Jeanty, a special player, in the backfield with him. And ultimately, they're in prime position to be the Group of 5 representative in the CFP for Jackson Dart, a player who a lot of people in the SEC have incredible respect for what he's done in his career at Ole Miss. Perhaps not necessarily going to have a playoff spot to talk about in the latter stages of his career, but I still think there's merit to what he's done to elevate this Ole Miss program. And Xavier Restrepo, another highly respected player in the college football landscape, someone who has never really had the opportunity to prove himself on a national scale, just because that Miami hasn't had the foundation, the structure, the identity that it needed. And finally, he has a quarterback, a team around him that can bolster him and elevate him and lift him up, so that even in a season where he might not be playing up to his standard, on a record-breaking day, he can be appreciated. So that's just about all I have to say for my college football fantasy start. But coming up after this short break, we start my positional rankings for Week 10 of the NFL with my QBs. So you definitely don't want to miss this one. We'll be right back after this short break.